My name is Seraphine Asheville, and I have spent my entire life being the woman men look past. Not because I was ugly, not because I was weak, but because I was quiet, because I carried my pain the way my mother taught me, pressed flat against my ribs, tucked behind a smile, never allowed to breathe too loud in a room where powerful people were speaking. My mother used to say that a woman who survived with grace was stronger than any warrior who survived with a sword. I believed her then. I am not sure I believe her now. I need to tell you what happened before the battlefield, before the silence, before the word that broke a king. I need to go back to the night everything I had built was destroyed in a single sentence, not with a blade, not with war, but with a growl and the sound of another woman's laughter in the dark. Let me take you back to the Silver Crest Palace, to the week before the harvest moon, the week I learned that loving someone fully is the most dangerous thing a woman like me could ever do. I had been Cale Dravenmore's queen for 11 months. 11 months of sleeping in a chamber that connected to his but never truly opened between us. 11 months of sitting beside him at feasts while he laughed with his war generals and barely turned to acknowledge me. 11 months of learning the names of every servant in the palace, healing the sick children of the lower villages, memorizing the trade routes and border agreements that the council ignored, because someone had to. And I had learned very quickly that being useful was the only currency I owned in this palace. Cale Dravenmore was the alpha king of the 7 territories. He was the kind of man that entire rooms rearranged themselves for. Tall, dark-haired, with gray storm eyes that had the particular quality of light that made you feel seen even when he wasn't looking at you. When he entered a space, the air shifted. Even his silence had weight. I had been fascinated by him before I was afraid of him. That is the dangerous thing about men like Cale. They make you fall before you understand what you are falling into. Our marriage had been arranged by my father, Lord Edric Asheville, the head of the Northern Alliance. My family's lands bordered 3 of the 7 territories. My hand in marriage secured a peace that had cost 600 lives to almost destroy. I did not resent this. I understood politics. I understood sacrifice. What I had not understood, what I had foolishly, desperately not understood, was that understanding the reason for a cage does not make the cage any less cold. The first months were not cruel, they were simply empty. Cale was not a man who shouted or struck or belittled with words in public. He was worse than that. He was indifferent. When he looked at me, I could see him filing me away in his mind under necessary, tolerable, not relevant. And I smiled at feasts and healed the sick and learned the territories and told myself that duty was enough. That purpose was enough. But the heart is a stubborn thing. Somewhere in the 7th month, I made the mistake of starting to love him. It happened slowly, the way all truly dangerous things do. I noticed the way he read late into the night, surrounded by maps and half-eaten bread, forgetting meals entirely when a strategic problem consumed him. I noticed how he visited the war memorial every full moon alone, running his fingers along the names carved in stone. I noticed that he was the first person in the palace awake every morning, standing on the eastern tower watching the sun come up like it owed him an answer. I never told him I had noticed. I simply started leaving a plate of food outside his study door on the nights I could hear him packing. He never acknowledged it, but the food was always gone by morning. That was the extent of what passed between us as something tender. Small, quiet things, plates of bread, a candle left burning in his window when I knew he would return late from council. Once, just once, during a rainstorm that cracked the sky open above the eastern gardens, we had stood together under a stone archway waiting for the downpour to pass, shoulders almost touching, and he had said, very quietly, "You're not afraid of storms." And I had said, "I grew up in the north. Everything up there is a storm." And he had almost smiled. I held on to that almost smile for 4 months. I watered it like it was a living thing. I was so desperate for it to grow into something real that I did not see what was already growing in the shadows beside it. Her name was Voracane. Lady Voracane, daughter of the High Warden of the Eastern Reaches, with copper-red hair and eyes the color of polished amber, and a laugh that carried across entire courtyards like she owned every inch of the air. She had arrived at court 6 weeks ago as part of a diplomatic delegation. She had stayed because Cale had not told her to leave. I noticed the way he watched her the same way I had once noticed him watching his maps, with that specific, consuming attention he gave only to things that mattered to him. I noticed how his jaw unclenched when she entered a room, how his voice dropped half a register when he spoke to her, how he laughed, actually laughed, at something she said at the third night's feast, throwing his head back with a sound I had never once heard directed at me. I did not make a scene. I did not cry at the table. I smiled and complimented Lady Vora's gown and told myself it meant nothing. That was the lie I was still telling myself on the night of the Harvest Eve celebration. The great hall of Silver Crest Palace was blazing. 300 candles, banners of every territorial color, the smell of roasted boar and spiced wine thick in the air. I had spent the morning in the lower village treating a fever that had spread through the children there, and I had come back barely in time to dress. My maid, a young girl named Tessely, had twisted my dark hair into something elegant with trembling, apologetic hands while I told her it was fine. It was always fine. I wore deep blue that night, the color of the northern sky just before it breaks into stars. I found Cale near the fire. He looked up when I approached. For just 1 second, one single second, something moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like the word beautiful, but it closed so fast I could not be certain it had been there at all. "You look well," he said, and it was the most he had offered me in days. "Thank you, Your Majesty," I said. And because I was tired of pretending, because 11 months of quiet endurance had worn something down inside me that used to be softer, I said, "Cale, my name is Seraphine. You haven't said it in 3 weeks." He looked at me then, really looked, and what I saw on his face was not cruelty. It was something worse. It was the expression of a man realizing he has been careless with something he didn't think he needed to be careful with. "Seraphine," he said, like he was testing its weight. And then Voracane laughed somewhere across the hall, and his eyes slid away from mine like water off stone, and I felt the last small warmth I had been carrying snuff itself out without ceremony. That was the last moment before everything broke. I did not stay for what came next. I did not need to watch. I heard it from Tessely, who heard it from the head steward, who had been standing in the corridor when Cale led Vora out onto the private terrace above the great hall and pressed his forehead to hers in the moonlight. What I heard next, I heard myself. Because the palace walls are old and the stone carries sound in the night, and I was sitting at my window, unable to sleep, when his voice came through the dark from the terrace below. "I know what I am asking," he said, low and sure. And then the sound I will never unhear, a sound I still wake up reaching for the edges of my bed to escape, a soft, sharp exhale from Vora, and Cale's growl, that deep alpha sound that means only one thing in our world, the sound of a mark being made. He had marked her. In our world, a mark is not a wound. It is a declaration. It is a king saying to the moon and the pack and every living thing under his dominion, "This one is mine. It cannot be taken back. It cannot be explained away." He had marked another woman. I sat on my windowsill with my knees pulled to my chest and my forehead pressed to the cold glass, and I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not send for my father or call for the council. I sat there until the light changed, and the night became morning, and somewhere in that long, terrible silence, I made a decision. If he did not want me, I would not beg. I would not bargain. I would not perform grief for an audience. I would simply stop being here. I dressed without Tessely's help. I packed only what I had carried into this palace, my mother's herb satchel. A book of northern remedies, 2 changes of clothes. I did not take the jewelry. I did not take the crown. I left them precisely arranged on the dressing table like a polite goodbye note to a life I had never truly been invited into. I was halfway down the eastern corridor when I heard his door open behind me. Seraphine. I stopped. I did not turn. His footsteps, close, too close. I could feel the heat of him the way you feel a fire even before you turn toward it. Where are you going? I finally turned. He was standing in his doorway in the dark, barefoot in a loose shirt, his hair uncharacteristically undone. He looked young in that light, almost uncertain. And I hated him for it because uncertain was the version of Cale I had always wanted to see, and I was seeing it now in this moment when it was too late to matter. I think you know where I'm going, I said. His jaw tightened. You can't just leave, you're the queen. I'm a political arrangement, I said, and my voice was so quiet and so steady that I almost frightened myself. You made that clear tonight. You made that clear 11 months ago. Something crossed his face, something I could not name and would not let myself reach for. Seraphine. Don't, one word. I let it land between us like a stone dropped in water. Don't say my name like it means something now, not tonight. He was quiet for a long moment. And then, and I will carry the weight of this for the rest of my life, he straightened. The uncertainty vanished. The Alpha King sealed himself back up behind his eyes like a gate being lowered, and what remained was cold and final and proud. Leave then, he said, low, controlled, a growl wrapped in a whisper, leave and never return. And I did. I walked out of Silver Crest Palace in the dark, and I did not look back, and I told myself the burning behind my eyes was from the cold night air and nothing else. I was wrong about many things in those days, but I was right about one thing. I was not going to break where he could see it. The North received me the way it always had, without softness. The journey from Silver Crest to the Asheville lands took 4 days on horseback through terrain that most people in the Southern Territories had never seen and did not want to. Steep stone valleys, forests so dense the noon sun could not crack them open, rivers that ran fast and black with iron sediment from the mountains above. I had grown up here. My body remembered it the way your lungs remember cold air, a small necessary shock, and then surrender. My father was standing in the courtyard when I arrived. He had aged in the 11 months I'd been gone. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His shoulders, once a wall against the world, carried a new kind of weariness. He looked at me when I dismounted, took in my single satchel, my plain traveling clothes, the absence of any royal guard, and his face did something complicated before it settled into stillness. He did not say, I told you so. My father was not that kind of man. What he said was, come inside, Seraphine. The fire's been burning for an hour. And I walked into the house I grew up in and sat at the long wooden table where I had done my childhood lessons and eaten 1,000 meals and learned the names of every herb in the northern hills. And my father poured 2 cups of strong black tea and sat across from me, and we did not speak for a long time. Just breathed, just existed in the same room, just allowed the grief to be quiet between us without demanding that it announce itself. Eventually I said, he marked someone else. My father's hands tightened briefly around his cup. I heard rumors. They weren't rumors. Another silence. Then what do you need? That question, that simple, enormous question, not what did you do wrong or how will this affect the alliance or do you understand what this means politically? Just, what do you need? I pressed my hands flat on the table and felt the grain of the old oak under my palms and said, I need to work. I need to be useful. I need to not think about it for a while. My father nodded once, slow and certain. Then tomorrow morning you go to the village clinic. Old Marin has been running it alone since her apprentice left for the capital. The fever that came through the southern border is crawling north. They need hands. Good, I said. And that was that. I did not wallow. That is not a virtue I am claiming. It was not bravery or strength that moved me out of bed the next morning. It was simply the only thing I knew how to do. My mother had been a healer, her mother before her. In our family, grief was not a thing you sat inside. It was a thing you carried while your hands did the work that needed doing. The work did not stop the grief, but it gave it somewhere to go. The village clinic at Asheville was small, stone-walled, perpetually smelling of dried herbs and wood smoke. Old Marin was 70 years old with hands like knotted rope and eyes sharp as a hawk's, and she looked me up and down on my first morning with the frank assessment of someone who has no time for pretense. "You're the queen," she said. "I'm a healer," I said. "The other thing didn't stick." Marin studied me for one more second. Then she handed me a stack of bandages and pointed at the door. "Second patient on the left has a wound that's been festering 3 days. Don't be gentle. Gentle won't save the leg." I was not gentle, and the leg was saved. Marin and I did not speak much about personal things for the first 2 weeks. We worked. There was enough work to fill every waking hour and push the edges of sleep into exhaustion so deep that dreaming became impossible, which suited me exactly. The fever from the south was indeed moving north, and with it came the particular cruelty that illness always shows to the young and the old first. I sat with 3 children through the worst nights of their fevers. I sat with an old shepherd whose lungs were filling with fluid, holding his hand through the dark hours when he was too weak to speak and too frightened to be alone. These were the things I carried instead. It was Tessely who found me 3 weeks after I'd left the palace. She appeared at my father's gate on a gray morning with her traveling cloak still damp from the road, her young face flushed from riding, and her eyes red from something I suspected was not just the wind. "They told me you'd left," she said. "I wasn't going to come, then I couldn't not." I brought her inside and made her eat something before I let her speak. She was the kind of young woman who forgot to take care of herself in a crisis, and I had learned to head that off early. When she was warm and fed, she looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has been carrying news that weighs more than she expected. "You should know what's happening at court," she said. "You don't have to tell me," I said. "It's not my court anymore." "I think you should know anyway." I looked at her. "Then tell me." What Tessely told me in the next hour rearranged several things I had believed to be true. Lady Voracane, she said, had not been the innocent victim of a king's impulsive heart. She had come to court with a plan that had been months in the preparation. Her father, High Warden Carrows Kane, had a political agreement with 3 of the 7 territorial lords, an agreement that would shift significant power away from the central throne and toward the Eastern Bloc, where the Kanes held the most influence. The simplest path to making that agreement permanent was placing Vora on the throne. "The mark," Tessely said, her voice dropping. "There are people at court who are saying it was not entirely willing on his part." I went very still. "Explain that." "There are herbs, my lady, from the East, old, strong herbs that affect judgment, that make the wolf rise before the mind can stop it. I heard the head cook telling someone that Vora had been preparing something special for the king's wine for weeks before the harvest feast." I stared at the table for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, wind pressed against the stone walls of my father's house. "That is a very serious accusation," I said carefully. "I know. Do you have proof?" "Not yet, but your father's contact in the Eastern trade routes, he's been asking questions." I did not speak for a while. There were things moving inside my chest that I needed to sort carefully from each other. There was grief. There was something that might have been anger, or might have been the last remnant of the love I had been trying to set down since the night I left. And underneath both of those, cold and clear, was something else. A feeling I recognized from the clinic, from the worst nights with the sickest patients. The feeling of a crisis that is already here, that cannot be waited out. That requires someone to do something. "Go back to the palace," I told Tessely. "Keep your head down. Watch. Don't say a word to anyone about what you've told me." "And you?" she asked. I stood and began clearing the table. "And I will keep working," I said, "for now." But something had shifted. Some careful, managed door inside me had come open a crack, and through it I could feel the edges of a much larger story, one I was not yet ready to walk back into. Not yet, but soon. Cale Dravenmore had ruled the 7 territories for 9 years, and in all of that time, he had never been afraid. He had been tested. He had been bloodied. He had walked into battle with his wolf roaring through his bones and come out the other side carrying the dead on his shoulders and burying them with his own hands. He had sat in the council room for 14 consecutive hours while territorial lords screamed across the table at each other and mediated agreements that no one was happy with because that was what peace cost. He had stood at his parents' funeral when he was 23 and told himself that grief was a private thing, and he had kept that promise so faithfully that by the time he was 32, he was not entirely sure the private version of himself was still there. He was not afraid of any of that. He had learned to hold those things the way a man holds a torch, at arm's length, controlled, useful, and careful, never to let the flame touch anything it wasn't meant to burn. But in the 6 weeks since Seraphine left, Cale Dravenmore was afraid. Not of enemies, not of war, though war was coming. The border reports were deteriorating with every passing week, and the Eastern Territories were moving troops in patterns that his war generals described in carefully neutral language that did not hide what they actually meant. Not of political collapse, though Vora's presence was beginning to do things to the court's internal dynamics that he was only just starting to see clearly. He was afraid of his wolf. The wolf had always been the part of him that was simple, direct, certain. The wolf did not negotiate. It did not perform. It did not manage perception or maintain alliances through carefully worded treaties. The wolf knew what it wanted and it acted, and it was right in the way that all simple, honest things are right. In 9 years of rule, when the human part of Cale became tangled in the complexity of power, the wolf had always been the thing he could trust. The wolf had gone quiet. Not gone, he could still feel it, but it had retreated to a place so deep inside him that reaching it was like trying to reach something through fog. His partial shifts, which had once been as easy as breathing, now required effort that left him shaking. In training with his war generals, he had barely managed a full shift for the first time since he was 16 years old. He had dismissed his generals afterward and sat alone in the training yard trying to understand what was happening to his own body. He had not connected it to Seraphine, not at first. He had connected it to stress, to the growing border tensions, to the strange physical heaviness that had settled in his chest since the harvest feast. He had told himself it was the season, the pressure, the weight of a 9-year reign reaching a critical inflection point. Then one night deep past midnight, he woke from a dream that was not a dream. It was a memory. Seraphine at the harvest feast in deep blue, looking at him with those dark, patient eyes, saying, "You haven't said it in 3 weeks." And then her name, which he had said so rarely while she was here that saying it now in the dark of his chamber, alone, felt like finding something he had left out in the rain. Seraphine. The wolf moved, just slightly, just enough to feel like a breath taken after too long without air. He sat up and put his hands on his knees and stared at the wall and tried to understand what had just happened. He sent for Elder Rowena the next morning. Elder Rowena was the oldest shifter in the 7 territories, a woman of 92 years who had served 4 generations of Alpha Kings and had earned the right to say whatever she thought without wrapping it in diplomacy. She arrived at his study with the particular unhurried movement of someone who has nothing left to prove, settled herself in the chair across from his desk, and looked at him with the calm assessment of a woman reading weather. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you, Elder. I need your counsel." "You need more than my counsel. What have you done?" He told her all of it. The mark, Seraphine leaving, the wolf's retreat. She listened without interrupting, which was not a quality Elder Rowena typically displayed, which meant she found this serious enough to require full attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me, when you made the mark, was the decision yours?" Something cold moved through him. "What do you mean?" I mean exactly what I said. Was it a decision, or did you find yourself having already done it? The silence in the room became very specific. Cale turned the memory over carefully. The harvest feast, the wine, the terrace. He remembered the warmth of the wine spreading through him faster than it should have. He remembered a kind of unnatural urgency, a pressure in his chest, the wolf surging forward with none of its usual deliberateness. He remembered thinking distantly that something felt wrong, and then the thought had been gone before he could catch it. He stopped. Yes, said Elder Rowena, that is the right hesitation. Are you saying the mark was made under influence? I am saying it is possible. There are herbs used in the Eastern Territories, old knowledge passed down through certain lineages that can accelerate the wolf bond, suppress the human mind's objections long enough for the body to act. She paused. I am also saying that this would explain certain things. The wolf's retreat, the fog you describe. When an alpha's wolf is manipulated into a bond it did not freely choose, it can reject the connection. Not the mark itself, the mark is made, but the deeper bond. The one that should exist below the mark. The wolf refuses it. And what does that mean? It means the mark on Voracane is a wound, Rowena said bluntly. Not a bond. It exists on the surface, but your wolf does not recognize her as its chosen. And because the wolf cannot accept the forced connection, it is retreating from the connection entirely, protecting itself by going still. How do I fix it? Rowena looked at him with the expression of a woman who has watched too many kings ask questions they already know the answer to. The wolf will answer to one thing only, she said. Its true bond, the one it actually chose, before the herbs, before the harvest feast, before you performed the great foolishness of letting pride and inattention cost you the most important thing in your court. He knew what she meant. He did not say the name out loud, but he felt the wolf move again at the edges of his mind, slow and heavy, like something turning in sleep, reaching for something it recognized, something it had known and been denied and was now quietly beginning to grieve. She left, he said. The words tasted like iron. You told her to, Rowena said without cruelty. He did not answer. There is another matter, Rowena continued, and her voice shifted into the register it used for things that were both true and terrible. The border reports you received this morning. I have seen the troop movements. I have also spoken to traders from the eastern routes. Cale. She used his name without his title, which she did only when she considered what she was about to say to be the most important thing in the conversation. The Eastern Bloc is not preparing for a border skirmish. They are preparing for a campaign. They are preparing to move on all 7 territories, and their plan requires the throne to be compromised from within before the armies reach the gates. He absorbed this slowly. Vara and her father, and the 3 lords who have already pledged to the Eastern Bloc. Rowena folded her hands. The mark was not love, Cale. It was a key placed into the lock of the palace from the inside. He stood from his chair so fast it scraped the stone floor. 9 years of rule, 9 years of strategy and sacrifice, and holding this kingdom together with both hands. And he had been manipulated into handing the enemy a door. Where is she? He asked. Not Vora, the name he did not say out loud. The North, Rowena said simply, where she has always been, where good things go when they have been poorly treated. He crossed to the window and looked north, which was something he had found himself doing more and more in recent weeks, without fully understanding why. The wolf pressed against the inside of his chest. Go, it said, the clearest word it had spoken in 6 weeks. Go. He did not go, not yet. There were things to do first, walls to check, threats to assess, a kingdom to secure before he could do the personal work that needed doing. He told himself this was strategy. He told himself he was being responsible. Elder Rowena gathered her cloak and rose to leave. At the door she paused. One more thing. The wolf will not shift for you, not fully, not until the bond it recognizes is restored. And the war that is coming will require your full self, every piece of it. She left, Kale stood at the window for a long time, looking north, feeling something inside him pull and pull and pull in a direction he had been refusing to walk for 6 weeks. The battlefield would not wait much longer. And neither, he was beginning to understand, would everything he had thrown away. 6 weeks became 8, 8 became 10. The north filled me up the way it always had with work, with cold, clean air, with the particular dignity of being needed in ways that had nothing to do with politics or appearances. Old Marin had taken to leaving me the most difficult cases without apology, because she had determined in her efficient, unsentimental way that I was competent and competent people got the hardest work. I did not mind. The hard work was the only kind that left me too tired to think. But I was thinking, despite myself, despite every effort. Tessely had gone back to the palace as I'd asked, and her letters arrived every few days through the trade route courier system, written in the careful, neutral language of someone writing in a house where the walls have ears. Between the words, I learned things. I built a picture from fragments, the way you assemble a map from partial surveys. Vora was establishing herself with aggressive speed. New advisors from the Eastern Territories appeared at court with every passing week. 3 of the older council members had been quietly removed from key positions and replaced with men whose loyalty, my father's contacts confirmed, ran east rather than inward. The treasury was being audited by people who answered to Warden Kane, not to the king. And Kale. Tessely's letters about Kale were the ones I read twice, and then set face down on the table and walked away from. He was not sleeping. He was attending council meetings but leaving decisions unmade that should have been made easily. His wolf, according to the palace shifters who trained with him, had become something they spoke about in lowered voices, withdrawn, unreachable. The king, who had once been the most formidable shifter in the 7 territories, could barely hold a partial shift for more than a few minutes. I told myself this was not my concern. I told it to myself firmly and with conviction. I told it to the fire at night when I couldn't sleep. I told it to the hills on my morning walks when the northern light came in sideways and turned everything gold, and the quiet was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I told it to the back of my hands while I pressed them against small, warm foreheads checking fevers. I told it until the telling began to sound less like conviction and more like a woman arguing with herself. Because here is what I could not make myself stop knowing. If what Tessely had told me about the herbs was true, then the mark Kale had placed was not freely made. And if it was not freely made, then everything I had decided about that night, everything I had built my leaving on, every piece of the story I had been telling myself about a man who had never wanted me, was a story built on a foundation that was partly not true. I was not naive enough to think that made everything fine. He had still been inattentive for 11 months. He had still looked past me. He had still let the distance between us grow until it had weight and temperature. None of that was the herbs. None of that was Vora. That was the man himself, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. But the mark was something else. The mark was something that had been done to him, and the thought of that, of Kale being manipulated in a way he did not understand, did not choose, and could not see coming, lived in a specific place in my chest that I could not argue away. I was in the clinic one afternoon, grinding feverfew with a stone pestle, when my father appeared in the doorway. He had a particular expression I recognized from childhood. The face he made when he had something to say that he was pretty sure I wasn't going to like. "Someone arrived at the gate this morning," he said. "Who?" "A palace messenger, carrying a personal letter." I set down the pestle. "From." My father placed the letter on the work table. The seal was black wax, imprinted with the wolf-fin crown of the Dravenmore line. My hands did not shake when I picked it up. I was proud of that briefly. I broke the seal. The letter was short. Kale's handwriting, which I knew from the few official documents he had signed in my presence, angular, precise, the letters pressed into the page with the slight heaviness of a man who grips things too tight. It read, "There are things I was wrong about. There are things that have happened that you deserve to know. I am not asking you to return. I am asking for the chance to speak. If you will not see me at the palace, I will come north. Tell me where." No apology, no declarations, no beautiful words wrapped around the ask to soften it. Just the facts plainly stated, and the ask plainly made. I read it twice. Then I folded it and held it and looked at the wall for a while. My father was still in the doorway. "You don't have to," he said. "I know. But you're going to." I was quiet for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that I needed to be ready for. "Not because of him," I said, "because of what's happening at the borders. Because if the Eastern Bloc is doing what Tessely's letters suggest, every healer in the North is going to be needed within the season. And because—" I stopped. "Because," my father said gently, "because I think someone did something to him that he doesn't fully understand yet," I said. "And whatever else I feel about Cale Dravenmore, I cannot stand by while a kingdom is taken apart from the inside. That's not about love. That's about what's right." My father nodded slowly. "That sounds very reasonable," he said. "Don't," I said. "I didn't say anything." "You were going to." He smiled a small, private smile. "I was going to say that your mother used to give me that exact speech when she was about to do something brave that terrified her. She would explain all the practical reasons at great length and in very clear language." I looked at him. "She always left out the part where she loved your father more than she could stand not fighting for," he said. "She never said that part aloud either." I picked up the pestle and went back to grinding the feverfew. "Send the messenger back with a reply. Tell him to come north. Tell him to come alone. And tell him," I paused, "tell him I will listen. That is all I am promising, that I will listen." My father took the letter. At the door he paused, and the look he gave me was the most specific kind of love, the kind that does not require you to be right or safe or protected from all difficulty. Just the kind that says, "I see you. I'm still here. Carry on." I ground the feverfew until my arm ached, and when I finally stopped, I sat in the quiet of the clinic and let myself feel, just for a moment, without analyzing or managing or keeping it pressed flat against my ribs. I felt afraid. I felt the tight, specific ache of someone who has survived a wound by not touching it, who now has to decide whether to let a surgeon near the scar. And underneath that, quieter and more stubborn than everything above it, I felt something I was not ready to name, something that had never quite gone cold no matter how many night hours I had spent trying to extinguish it. I pressed it back down, not forever, not even for long, but for now. He arrived on a Tuesday when the northern sky was the color of iron, and the first snow of the season was threatening the hills. I saw him from the clinic window before he reached the gate. He came alone, as I had asked, no guard, no formal escort, just Cale Dravenmore on a dark horse moving through the gray light with the particular self-contained stillness of a man who has ridden a long way inside his own head. He looked different. It was not a dramatic difference. His bearing was the same, spine straight, jaw set, the quality of careful control he wore like armor. But there were shadows under his eyes that had not been there before, and something in the set of his shoulders was less rigid than I remembered. Less defended, like a wall that is still standing but has lost some of the certainty of its own permanence. I did not go to the gate. I let Tessely bring him through to the small stone room at the back of my father's house that I used as a study, with its 2 chairs and its low fire and its stacks of medical texts, and the herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling beam. I wanted to meet him on ground that was mine. I needed that particular evening of the ground. He ducked through the low doorway and stopped when he saw me. And for a moment we both simply stood in the reality of each other's presence, which was stranger and more complicated than either of us had probably prepared for. Seraphine, he said, my name in his voice, still strange, still too much. Sit down, I said, practical, controlled. You've ridden a long way. He sat. I sat across from him. The fire was between us, and I was grateful for the light it gave me somewhere to look other than directly at him. I will say what I came to say, he began. Please. The mark was made under influence. I have spoken to Elder Rowena. I have also had my personal physician examine the wine vessels from the harvest feast. The residue found in my cup matches a compound from the Eastern Territories that is known to accelerate the wolf bond and suppress the rational mind's ability to interrupt it. He said it with the clean precision of a man reporting tactical intelligence, which I suspected was the only way he could get through it without it destroying him. I did not choose it, Seraphine. I need you to know that. I looked at the fire. I know, I said. A beat of silence. You knew. Tessely told me what she suspected. My father's contacts in the Eastern trade routes confirmed the rest. I paused. I have known for several weeks. Something moved through his expression that was difficult to watch, and you didn't. Come back, I met his eyes. What would I have come back to, Cale? An apology doesn't fix 11 months. An apology doesn't explain why I ate alone at that table more nights than I can count, why you never once asked what I thought about the border policies I had been studying, why you never. I stopped myself. I'm not doing this right now. You came here to tell me something. Tell me all of it. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing the hit, which was fair because I had aimed it. Then he told me everything. The wolf's retreat, Elder Rowena's assessment, the border reports, and these he laid out in careful, detailed sequence, because this was not personal, this was political, this was the actual emergency that had brought him here alongside the personal emergency, and I needed to hear it. The Eastern Bloc was mobilizing. 17,000 troops had been confirmed across 4 different border points. The 3 compromised lords had already begun restricting supplies to the Western Territories, a slow strangulation that would weaken the 7 territories from the inside before the armies arrived at the gates. And the timeline, based on the troop movements, was shorter than anyone at court had yet accepted. 6 weeks, he said, maybe 8, before the first major campaign push. Does the council know the full picture? Half of them are compromised, the other half are afraid. And Vora. His jaw worked. She is still at court. The mark, he stopped. I cannot simply undo it, you know that. A mark can be worked around but not erased, not unless the bond underneath it is replaced by a stronger one, I said quietly. He looked at me. The fire crackled. Outside, the first few flakes of snow had begun to fall against the window. Elder Rowena said something to me, he said, and his voice had changed registers. Dropped the tactical precision. Become something less armored, which was terrifying in its way, because an armored Cale was a Cale I knew how to handle. She said the wolf will only answer to its true bond, that it has been refusing the forced connection and retreating because of it. And that. He stopped. And that what? I said, careful, very still. And that it knows, the wolf, it knows its real choice. It chose before the herbs, before the manipulation, before I was stupid enough to let 11 months go by without seeing what was in front of me. His voice was very even, which meant it was costing him a great deal to keep it that way. It chose you, Seraphine. My wolf chose you. The room was very quiet. I looked at my hands, at the table, at the fire, at all the neutral things. That is the wolf, I said, not you. I know. The wolf is not the man. You told me with your own behavior for 11 months that I was a convenience, not a choice. I know, he said again. I'm not asking you to forgive that in this room tonight. I'm not asking you to come back because the wolf needs you or because the kingdom needs the alliance. I came here because. He paused for a long time, long enough that I looked up. And when I did, the expression on his face was one I had never seen on Cale Dravenmore before. Not uncertainty, not coldness, not the careful blankness of a man managing his image. Just something raw and real and very frightened. Because somewhere between you leaving food outside my study door and you standing in the corridor with your one bag telling me my name meant nothing, I understood that I had been an extraordinary fool. And I have been living in that understanding for 10 weeks, and I am still here. So whatever that counts for, that. I stood up from my chair, not away from him, just needing to move, needing the physical expression of the thing happening inside me. I walked to the window and looked out at the snow, which was falling properly now, soft and unhurried, covering the hills in white. I had spent 10 weeks building a careful, sensible structure of emotional distance. Brick by brick, reason by reason, it was very well constructed. It was still mostly standing. But there is something about the truth, said plainly and without armor, by someone who is clearly terrified of it themselves, something that reaches right through a wall without bothering to knock. "I'm not coming back to be your queen in name and nothing else," I said, still looking at the snow. "I am not coming back to eat alone and be decorative. If I come back as a full partner. I have ideas about the healer corps that could transform the military response to this campaign. I have been studying the border agreements, and there are 3 that can be restructured to pull the compromised lords back into line without war. If I come back, those contributions are real and they are respected, not filed away and forgotten." "Yes," he said. "And I need time. Whatever this is between us, whatever the wolf knows that you're still figuring out, I need time to reach it from my side. I cannot simply—" "I know," he said quietly. "I am not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. I am asking you to come back, to be present, to let whatever this is between us exist in the same space long enough for it to become something real. I will earn the rest, if you let me." I turned from the window. He was watching me with those storm-gray eyes, and he looked for the first time since I had known him like a man who was not performing, not managing, not containing, just a man, present and scared and trying. "I will need 3 days," I said. "Take the 3 days. And you will not push. You will let me come to my own conclusions." "I will try," that is the honest answer. Something in my chest shifted, very slightly. A door not flung open, barely cracked, but cracked. "Go sleep," I said. "My father will have given you a room. You look like you haven't slept in a month." He stood, moved toward the door, paused. "Seraphine." I waited. "The plate of bread," he said. "Outside the study door, every night." A pause. I didn't know how to say what I needed it to mean, but I knew what it meant. I knew. He left. I stood in the study with the snow falling outside and the fire dying down to embers, and the echo of that last sentence settling into the quiet. I knew. Sometimes that is the most heartbreaking and most hopeful thing a person can say. I came back to Silvercrest Palace 10 days later. Not because I had resolved all my doubts, not because everything was healed or forgiven or settled, but because the Eastern Bloc's timeline had accelerated. New troop movements reported at the northern border crossings, the farthest ones, the ones that meant the campaign had begun its opening movements. And because a kingdom on the edge of war needed people who could hold it together, and I had spent 10 weeks becoming something harder and more purposeful than the woman who had left. Also, if I am being honest with myself, and I am trying to be honest with myself, even when it is uncomfortable, because Kale had said I knew, and I had spent 3 days and 7 nights unable to stop hearing it. The palace was different when I walked back into it. The difference was mostly in the air, a tightness, a heightened alertness, the particular quality of a place that knows something is coming and is deciding how to hold its shape in the face of it. Guards at positions where there had not been guards before. Council members moving quickly through corridors with the expressions of people carrying more weight than they want to show. A palace in the opening hours of war preparation looks very much like a person trying not to panic. Busy, precise, slightly too controlled. Kale met me in the entrance hall. No ceremony, no assembled nobles. Just him, and behind him, Elder Rowena, and my maid Tessely at the edge of the room with her face doing something she was trying very hard to keep composed. "Welcome back," Cale said, and there was something in it that was not formal, not quite personal yet, not in front of the room, but the edge of something that reached through the formal and touched the real. "Thank you," I said. "Tell me what I've missed." He told me, walking through the corridor toward the war room, side by side for the first time. No space between us, maintained with careful precision, just two people walking toward the same problem. Vorakane had not left the palace. The mark complicated the political situation. Removing her by force would give the Eastern Bloc the justification they had been looking for to claim the king had broken a sacred bond, which under Eastern territorial law gave them the right to declare protection of their citizen and move armies to enforce it. Cale was aware of the trap. He had been careful not to touch it. "She knows you know," I said. "Yes, she's been very composed about it, which tells me her father's plan has contingencies." "What does she want?" "What she always wanted, the throne, or, failing that." His voice was quiet. "Enough disruption to weaken the Central Territories before the armies arrive." We reached the war room. Maps spread across the long table, weighted at the corners, covered in markings I had not made. I walked to the nearest one and looked at it. "Here," I said, pointing. "The northern supply route. If the Eastern Bloc pushes through here first, and they will, it's the obvious opening. The Western territories lose their grain access before winter. The people starve. The army can't hold a siege on empty stomachs." Cale's war general, a weathered man named Brennan Orveld who had served 3 Alpha Kings, and had the particular no-nonsense quality of a man who has seen too much to be impressed by anything, looked up from across the table and studied me. "The Queen is correct," he said, as if assessing a tactical report. "No fanfare, just acknowledgement." I worked in the war room for 5 hours that first day. By the end of it, Brennan Orveld was directing his questions as much to me as to Cale, and the 3 restructured border agreements I had drafted in the north were being circulated to the compromised territorial lords with the explicit message that the throne had options they had not counted on. It was not a victory. It was a beginning of a counter-movement. But it had a shape and a direction, and those 2 things are the most important things you can give to a situation that has been shapeless and directionless. That evening, Cale found me in the small room I had been given, my old chambers, which Tessely had quietly prepared without anyone needing to ask her. I was sitting at the desk writing out a full assessment of the Northern Healer Corps capacity to support a military campaign, because if there was going to be a battle, there were going to be wounded, and organized care was the difference between a recoverable casualty rate and a catastrophic one. He knocked, waited for me to acknowledge it, came in and stood for a moment, looking at the papers spread across the desk. "You've been working since this morning," he said. "So have you. You haven't eaten since midday." I looked up. He was holding a covered plate. I recognized the gesture with a shock of something sharp and warm that I was not ready for. The plate of bread outside the study door returned to me in a different form. "Put it down," I said, not unkindly. "Sit if you want. I have one more section to finish." He put the plate down and sat in the chair near the window and did not speak, which was, I was learning, a quality of Cale's I had not given proper credit for before. He could be present without demanding anything of the presence. When the silence was not cold, when it was simply 2 people occupying the same space without performing for each other. It was actually one of the most comfortable things I had been inside in a very long time. I finished the section, set down the pen, pulled the plate toward me. "The 3 lords," I said, pulling the cover off the food. "Aldrich Morn, Bastion Vel, and Cador Streen. What do you know about their specific vulnerabilities?" He told me. We ate and talked strategy until the fire had died twice and Tessely had crept in to rebuild it once, giving me a look over Cale's head that I did not dignify with a response. At some point past midnight, the strategy conversation had become quieter, less structured, the kind of talking that happens when the official purpose has been exhausted and what remains is the actual people. "You studied the border agreements while you were in the North," he said. "All of them." "I had time. That is weeks of documentation." "I was in the North, Cale. It gets dark early," I read. He was quiet for a moment. "I should have been the one teaching you. When you first arrived, I should have sat with you at those maps." I did not pretend that wasn't true. "Yes," I said simply. "I was an idiot." "Yes," I said again. Something like a laugh moved through him, brief, rueful, real. And then he was looking at me with those storm-gray eyes and the quality of attention I had spent 11 months waiting for, and I understood that this was the thing I had always wanted from him. Not declarations, not grand gestures, just this being seen. Properly. With all of it registered. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking we have 6 weeks," I said. "Let's not waste them." It was not a declaration of love. It was not forgiveness complete and unconditional. It was something more honest than both of those things. It was two people with something unfinished between them, choosing, in the middle of a crisis, to turn toward each other instead of away. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. I should have expected it. I did not expect it. The thing about a cornered opponent who is intelligent is that they do not become predictable when they are afraid. They become creative. Vora Kane was very intelligent. She had been quiet since my return, composed, as Cale had said, moving through the palace with the serene self-possession of a woman who had not yet played her final card. I watched her at meals, at the public council sessions where her presence was still technically permitted in the corridors. She watched me back. We were both too old for the kind of female rivalry that required it to be performed loudly, so what existed between us was quieter and more dangerous. Two people who understood each other's position exactly. She made her move on a Sunday evening during the weekly council gathering, and she made it well. Standing in the council chamber with 40 witnesses, she produced a document. Not any document, a formal territorial claim, witnessed by her father and 3 Eastern lords, which stated that the mark given to her by the Alpha King constituted, under ancient Eastern law, a formal marriage bond, and that the arrival of a former wife in the palace, particularly a former wife who was now actively participating in war strategy councils, constituted a challenge to that bond. A challenge that, under the same ancient Eastern law, required formal arbitration by an independent body. An independent body that, conveniently, the Eastern territories had the treaty right to appoint. The genius of it was that she was not threatening violence. She was threatening process. Slow, grinding, legitimate-seeming process that would tie the central throne in legal and diplomatic knots for months, during which time the Eastern armies would continue advancing, the compromised lords would continue restricting supplies, and the 7 territories would slowly unravel from the inside. I watched the council room absorb the document. I watched 3 of the compromised lords attempt to hide their satisfaction. I watched Cale's jaw tighten with the specific tension of a man being handed a trap so elegant he is briefly forced to admire it. Then I stood up. "May I see the document?" I said, calm, exact. Vora's eyes came to me. She handed it over with a gracious smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. I read it carefully. The council chamber was very still. I could feel the specific quality of a room full of people watching to see what will happen next, and I was aware that this was a moment with a shape that would be determined by how I handled the next 2 minutes. I set the document on the table. "This document references the Treaty of Ashenvale as its authority," I said. "Specifically, the secondary clause regarding marked bonds. Is that correct?" Vora's smile was precise. "Correct." "The Treaty of Ashenvale," I continued, reaching into the stack of documents I had, somewhat by instinct, brought with me to the council session because I had learned early in my return that in this palace, on this particular problem, having the right piece of paper at the right moment was worth more than any sword, was amended 14 years ago by the joint signing of the border accords. Specifically, the amendment removed the secondary clause from enforceability in territories outside the Eastern Bloc, and under Article 7 of the border accords, I placed my own document on the table alongside hers. All 7 territories are defined as central governed territory, which means the secondary clause has no legal authority here. Silence. Vora's composure flickered, just slightly, just for a second, long enough to see. Furthermore, I said, and I kept my voice even, the mark itself was made under documented chemical influence, evidence of which has been submitted to Elder Rowena as keeper of Pack law. Under Pack law, which supersedes Eastern territorial law in all 7 territories, a bond made under manipulation is classified as incomplete, which means there is no formal marriage bond, which means this document has no standing. The silence in the room was the kind that feels like a held breath across 40 people simultaneously. Lord Brennan Orveld, who had been watching from the far end of the table, pressed his lips together. "The Queen makes a sound legal argument," he said, in his dry, absolute way. Cale, who had been very still through this entire exchange, looked at me with an expression I would need several days to fully unpack, and then he turned to the council. "The document is dismissed," he said. "Lord Morn, Vel, Streen, this council is aware of your correspondence with the Eastern Bloc. You have one opportunity to withdraw your pledges before formal proceedings begin. I suggest you use it." Lord Morn started to speak. Cale silenced him with a look that contained the full weight of 9 years and a wolf that was, I felt it, even from across the table, the specific pressure of it in the air, beginning, very slowly, to reassemble itself. The session ended within the hour. Vora Kane left the council chamber with the expression of a chess player watching her final piece leave the board. I found her in the corridor afterward. Not deliberately, I had not sought this conversation, but she came to a stop when she saw me, and something in the lines of her face had shifted from the composed mask of the council chamber into something more raw, more real, and honestly more human. "That was well done," she said, and to her credit she said it without venom. "I spent a lot of time reading," I said. We looked at each other for a moment. In another life, another world, she and I might have been allies. She was not a stupid woman. She was not even, I thought, at her core, an evil one. She had been shaped by a father whose ambitions had treated her as a tool, and she had learned to use the tools available to her the way anyone raised that way learns to survive. "What happens to me now?" she said. "That depends on you," I said. "If you cooperate with the investigation into the herbs, testimony, full testimony, there is a difference between being a pawn used by your father and being the architect of treason." She was quiet for a long moment. Something moved behind her amber eyes that I thought might have been relief, though it was wrapped so tightly in everything else it was hard to be certain. "I will think about it," she said. "Think quickly," I said. "The Eastern armies are not waiting." I walked away. Behind me, I heard her exhale, long, slow, the sound of someone putting down a weight they had been carrying so long they had forgotten what it felt like not to. The night before the armies reached our northern border was the quietest night I have ever known. The palace was not quiet in its usual sense. There were movements, preparations, the low, urgent sounds of a kingdom placing itself into a battle footing, armor being checked, horses being prepared, messengers moving in every direction. But underneath all of that, underneath the human machinery of war, there was a particular stillness. The kind that lives in the space between what is about to happen and what has not yet happened. A pause that belongs to nobody, and therefore belongs to everyone equally. I found Cale on the eastern tower, where he went to watch the sun rise, where I had observed him going, alone, from the very first weeks of my time here, before I understood that this was where he came to be human in the private way that the rest of his life did not allow. He heard me coming, turned before I reached him. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." The eastern sky was dark, still hours from dawn. Below us, the torches of the war camp burned in lines that were almost beautiful from this height, if you could forget what they meant. "The wolf," he said without preamble, "it's been shifting back, slowly, the past 2 weeks." "I noticed," I said. "In the council sessions, the air changes when you're accessing it." He looked at me with a question in his eyes. "You can feel it." I always could, since the first month. I kept my voice matter of fact. I didn't know what it meant then. "What did you think it meant?" "I thought it meant you were angry, or focused, or—" I paused. I didn't understand the bond mechanics well enough to read it accurately. I know more now. He was very still. "How much more?" "Enough," I said. "Enough to know that what Elder Rowena told you is accurate, and enough to know that I feel it too, the pull. I've been feeling it since." I thought about it honestly. "Since the gardens, month 3, I thought it was just loneliness expressing itself as attachment to the only person in the palace who occasionally acknowledged I existed." Something moved through him. "I acknowledged you more than you know," he said. "I was just terrible at showing it." "Yes," a pause. "Yes, that." The torches burned below us. Somewhere in the dark beyond the walls, thousands of men were settled into camps and sleeping, or lying awake the way you lie awake on the night before something that will change your life regardless of how it goes. "If this goes wrong tomorrow," Cale said, and his voice was very quiet, "I need you to know." "Don't," I said. "Seraphine, don't finish that sentence as though you might not come back. Finish it as though you will." He was quiet. Then slowly he turned to face me fully, and in the torchlight from below, in the dark before the dawn, I saw the version of him I had spent a year waiting for, not performing, not managing, not wearing the armor of Alpha King over the human being underneath, just Cale, present and scared and real. "I love you," he said, not desperate, not a speech, not ornamented with all the things he was bad at saying. Just the fact stated plainly, the way he had stated all the things that mattered most. I don't know when it became this, but it did. And I was too much of a fool for too long to say it, and I'm saying it now because. "Because tomorrow," I said. "Because tomorrow." I stepped close to him. The distance between us, which had always had so much weight, collapsed without ceremony. I took his face in my hands, which were a healer's hands, strong, practical, that had held broken things, and pressed them back together, and I made him look at me. "Come back," I said. "That is what I want, come back." He pressed his forehead to mine. The wolf, I felt it, not as an external pressure now, but as a warmth, a recognition, the specific quality of something completing a circuit it had been reaching for across a long and painful distance. "Your name," he said very quietly. When the wolf is quiet now, when I need to reach it, it's the only word that works. I found that out 2 weeks ago in training. Brennan thought I'd lost my mind. "What did you do?" Said your name, out loud in the middle of the training yard. A pause that contained something that was almost a laugh, and the wolf came back. I pulled back just enough to see his face. Something in my chest had come fully open. Not gradually, not carefully, just open. The way things open when you have held them closed so long that the holding itself becomes the exhausting thing. "Go to sleep," I said. "You need to be present tomorrow, all of you." "Yes," he said. He did not go immediately. He stood on the tower with me for a while longer, watching the dark eastern sky, not speaking, just present. And I stood beside him and felt the warmth of the wolf through the air between us and let myself exist, for the first time in a very long time, in a moment I did not need to protect myself from. The eastern armies reached the northern border at dawn. 17,000, as the reports had said. moving in the organized, disciplined formation of a force that had been preparing this campaign for years, confident in its size and in the internal damage it believed it had already done to its target. Confident in the fractured council, the weakened king, the political mess of a throne that had lost its queen and its wolf and its certainty. They did not know the queen had come back. They did not know that the three compromised lords, faced with the evidence that their private agreements were no longer private, that their supply restrictions had been documented, and that the Queen had restructured the border agreements in a way that rendered their positions legally untenable, had, over the previous 2 weeks, quietly withdrawn their Eastern pledges and sent formal reaffirmations of their central loyalty to the throne. They had done this not entirely willingly, but they had done it because the alternative was treason proceedings, and even ambitious men have a calculation they make when the numbers change. They did not know that the healer corps I had reorganized and equipped over the previous 2 weeks were deployed at 3 strategic positions behind the battle line, which meant that wounded soldiers would be returned to fighting condition at a speed that had never been managed before, which meant the effective fighting force was significantly larger than the troop numbers alone suggested. And they did not know what had happened on the eastern tower the night before. I was not on the battlefield. I want to be clear about that. I was not foolish enough to believe that my presence there would help anything except provide the enemy with a high-value target. I was at the northern command post, behind the ridge, with my healer corps and my maps and my direct line to Brennan Orville's field messengers. But I heard what happened. I was told by 14 different people in the hours and days after, each adding a detail the others had missed, and the picture that assembled was one I will carry for the rest of my life. The Eastern armies advanced with the certainty of a force that expects to meet a weakened opponent. What they met was the full wolf. Kale had shifted at the ridge. Full shift, not the partial, struggling thing it had been for weeks. Full, complete. The Alpha King in his wolf form, which those who had seen it described with the particular hushed quality of people trying to find language for something that exceeded their vocabulary. Massive, silver gray, the color of storm clouds on the move. Eyes that caught the dawn light like mirrors. The Eastern forces had faced wolf shifters before. They had not faced an Alpha King's full shift in a decade, because Kale's wolf had been strong enough that simply showing it, without the shift, was generally sufficient to manage a situation. This was different. This was the wolf that had been locked away for months, that had retreated and gone quiet and refused false bonds, unleashed completely, without restraint, without the managing quality that Kale usually imposed on it. The wolf that had needed one name to come back to itself. General Orville told me later, the Eastern front line stopped. I have never seen 17,000 men stop simultaneously. It was like watching a wave realize it's about to hit something larger than itself. The Eastern commanders had anticipated a wounded king, a politically compromised, wolf-weakened, isolated ruler holding a fractured kingdom together with political tape. What stood at the ridge was neither wounded nor isolated. What stood there had been forged in the furnace of 10 terrible weeks, had come through something that would have broken a lesser man, and had come out the other side with all the softness it had been carrying finally acknowledged, and all the strength that was always there burning clear and clean. The battle lasted 6 hours. Not because it was easy, it was not easy, and the wounded that came to my corps through those 6 hours were real wounds that real men carried, and I worked without stopping, and 2 of my healers worked until their hands shook, and we lost people we tried to save, and that is the true cost of war, and I will not pretend otherwise. But the Eastern forces, which had arrived expecting to end a kingdom, retreated across the northern border by midday. Not rooted, not destroyed, but clearly, unambiguously defeated in the way that matters most, which is not the defeat of bodies but the defeat of the belief that you are stronger than what you're facing. Warden Caro's cane, who had arrived with the Eastern force to personally witness what he had planned as a triumph, was taken prisoner at the ridge. He was brought to the command post in the early afternoon, and he looked, when they brought him in, like a man watching a very long plan fail in a way he had not accounted for. I looked at him and thought, this is what happens when you treat people as pieces on a board. Eventually the pieces become people again and the board becomes the floor. "Where is your daughter?" I asked him. He looked at me with the expression of a man recalculating. "At the palace," he said. "Why?" "Because she is going to testify," I said. "And what she says will determine whether this ends as a war crime or as a family tragedy. I would suggest you think about which version is better for her." It was late afternoon before I saw Cale. He came to the command post on foot, without ceremony, still in his traveling clothes from the field, with a cut on his forearm that had been bound in the field dressing but not properly treated. He walked through the post with the slightly unsteady quality of someone who has poured everything out and is now running on what remains at the bottom. I met him outside the tent. He stopped when he saw me, and for a moment I thought he might say something complicated and important and hard. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, just that. A hand around mine, very simple, very certain. "The arm," I said. "I know. Inside now." He followed me in without argument, which was notable, and sat on the supply chest without being told, which was also notable. I unwound the field dressing and examined the cut, clean, not deep, no infection risk, but it needed proper closing and worked while he watched my hands. "You restructured the border agreements," he said. "I had free time in the north." "You organized the healer corps in 2 weeks." "It wasn't complicated, it just needed someone to do it." "Seraphine." I paused in my work and looked up. "Thank you," he said, and it meant everything it was trying to mean, not just for the border agreements, not just for the healer corps, not just for the battle, for coming back, for the 11 months she had stayed when she had no real reason to, for the plate of food outside the study door, for all of it. "Don't thank me," I said, "be better." "I intend to," he said, and the wolf was there in his eyes when he said it, not violent, not possessive, just present, warm and certain and real. I finished closing the cut, tied the final bandage, did not move away immediately. His other hand, the uninjured one, came up and caught mine where it rested on his arm, held it, very gently, with the careful quality of someone holding something they do not want to break. "The name," he said quietly. "On the battlefield, when I needed the wolf, it was the only thing." "I know," I said. "Your name," he said, "is the only word my wolf will answer to." I looked at him for a long moment, at the storm-gray eyes that were finally, fully present, at the man who had spent a year being a fool and 10 weeks being honest, and one morning being the most formidable thing anyone on a northern battlefield had ever seen. "Then you'd better keep saying it," I said, "so it doesn't forget." He pulled my hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. Not a performance, not for an audience, just a man being as gentle and as certain as he knew how to be. And I let him, and I did not press it back down or manage it or keep it at a careful distance. Some doors, when they open, are supposed to stay open. 3 months after the Battle of the Northern Ridge. I sat in the East Garden of Silver Crest Palace in the thin winter sunshine, reading a report from the Healer Corps' new regional coordinator, a position I had created because the campaign had confirmed what I had always suspected, that organized medical support was not a luxury but a military necessity and a moral one. And trying to eat a piece of bread without Cale noticing I had not eaten breakfast. He noticed. "You skipped breakfast again," he said, appearing from the direction of the east corridor with a cup of something hot and the expression of a man who has been paying attention. "I had an early meeting with Brennan about the northern supply restoration. And bread is incompatible with meetings." I was going to eat later. It is later. He sat beside me on the stone bench and placed the cup in my hands. It was spiced tea, made the way I liked it, which he had learned without being told in the incremental way he had been learning most things about me since the autumn, quietly, attentively, without announcement. This was the version of Kale that the court was still adjusting to. Not cold, not distant, not the contained and managed alpha king who filed the people around him under necessary or irrelevant. Still precise, still formidable when formidable was required. Still the man who could silence a room with a look and command a battlefield from a ridge, but present in a way that had not been visible before, paying attention in a way that cost him something, and he paid it anyway. Vora Kane had given her testimony 6 weeks after the battle. Seated in front of a formal council and Elder Rowena and 2 independent territorial witnesses, she had laid out her father's plan with the thoroughness of someone who had decided that the only power she had left was the truth, and she was going to use it fully. Her account confirmed everything Tessely had suspected about the herbs, added details about the 3 lords' agreements that were damning enough to permanently dismantle the Eastern Bloc's political credibility, and implicated Warden Carrow's Kane in manipulation that went back not 6 months but 3 years. She was not pardoned, but she was not executed. She was returned to the Eastern Territories under a formal agreement that stripped her of any claim to Central Territorial rights and placed her under the Eastern Bloc's reformed governance, a governance that, after the exposure of her father's treason, was being rebuilt under new leadership that had reached out to the central throne with a humility that the Eastern Bloc had not displayed in a generation. It was not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions do not exist in politics or in people, but it was a real one, built on actual facts, and that is the most you can ask for. The mark on Kale faded over the 3 months after the battle. Not instantly, these things do not work instantly. But Elder Rowena had said that when a forced bond is deprived of its connection, when the wolf fully commits to its true bond instead, the false mark loses its hold gradually. By the first snow of winter, it was gone entirely. Just a faint discoloration, and then not even that. Kale told me when it disappeared. We were in the war room reviewing the supply restoration reports. Because the work did not stop, had never stopped, there was always the next thing to hold, and he had stopped mid-sentence and gone very still, and I had looked up from my papers and he had said, quietly, "It's gone." I had set down my pen, I had looked at him. "How do you feel?" "Like myself," he said. "I don't think I realized how much it wasn't until now." That evening we had dinner alone for the first time. Not a political dinner, not a council meal. Just the 2 of us in the small dining room off the east corridor with a fire and simple food and the absence of anything that needed to be performed. We talked about things that had nothing to do with the Eastern Bloc or border agreements or Healer Corps logistics. About small things. His mother, her mother, the Northern Hills. A book he had been reading about ancient wolf-shifter history that had 3 sections dedicated to fated bonds and which he admitted, been rereading with personal interest. "The texts say the wolf always knows," he said. "Before the human does," I agreed. "I think mine knew in the 4th month, that walk in the Eastern Garden, during the rainstorm." I looked at him. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about you that I didn't let myself understand at the time," he said. "I have been going back through all of it." "That sounds exhausting." "It is, but it is also," he paused, "it is the most honest thing I have done in years, reviewing all the places I chose not to see something because seeing it would have required me to change." "And have you changed?" He considered it seriously, the way Kale considered all things that mattered, not quickly, not to perform an answer, but actually. "I am changing," he said finally. "I think that is the honest version. I am not going to tell you I am a different man. I am telling you I am the same man who is finally deciding to do the things I always could have done if I had not been so committed to the armor." "That is the honest version," I said. I prefer it to the dramatic version. Good, because I am deeply incapable of the dramatic version. I know. I looked at him across the small table in the firelight. That is one of the things I stopped. Seraphine. Don't rush me, I said. I'm not. You are with that expression. Something moved through him that was absolutely a laugh contained behind immense effort. I am not saying a word. You are saying everything with your face. I am waiting, he said, with great patience for whatever you were about to say. I looked at the fire for a moment. Then I looked at him. At this man I had arrived to meet as a political arrangement, who had been cold and inattentive and genuinely, deeply foolish for almost a year, who had said leave and never return in a voice that had tried to be a wall and been a wound instead, who had come north alone, and said I was wrong in the plainest possible language, who had stood on a battlefield unable to shift, and whose wolf had answered to one word only. I love you, I said. I have loved you since probably month 4, which was extremely inconvenient, and I intend to keep loving you, which is going to require you to keep being the person you are currently being, so please do not regress. I won't, he said. I will hold you to that. I know you will. He reached across the small table and took my hand, and the wolf warmth was there, the bond warmth, the specific quality of two things that have been reaching for each other across an enormous and painful distance, finally, fully, meeting. I have something to ask you, he said. Then ask. I want to ask properly. Not because politics requires it, not because the council thinks it would stabilize territorial relations, not for any reason that has anything to do with anything except the fact that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known and my wolf knew it before I did, and I am asking, he paused. Will you be my queen? Not as a political arrangement, not as a title, as the person I have chosen. As my mate, freely and honestly chosen. No oaths involved except the one I am making to you right now. The fire crackled. Outside, snow was falling on the Silver Crest Gardens, on the old oak tree where he had almost kissed me and pulled back before he understood what he was feeling, on the eastern tower where we had stood the night before the battle, and he had said I love you in the plainest possible language into the dark. You already marked me, I said, or your wolf did. 3 months ago at the command post. I thought you might not have noticed. He went very still. Then I noticed. Good. Did you? Yes, I said simply. I felt it, and I didn't say anything because I wanted to see what you would do when you had time to actually think about it and choose it clearly. And you made me tea this morning and remembered how I take it and noticed I hadn't eaten breakfast. I looked at him across the table. That is more meaningful to me than any ceremony. I see. But yes, I said, the answer is yes. He brought my hand to his mouth again, the way he had at the command post. And then, without ceremony or performance, he simply looked at me with the full weight of his attention, the storm-gray eyes with the wolf warm behind them, the man finally present in all the ways he had failed to be for so long. Seraphine, he said. That's my name, I said. Yes, he said, it is. And the way he said it, not like a title, not like a political designation, not like a thing he had filed under necessary, but like something he was grateful for the sound of. Like something he would not forget to say. Like the one word his wolf had answered to on the morning of a battle when everything else had gone quiet. Like the most important word in his world. I had spent 11 months watching this man and hopping and quietly building a life in the margins of his inattention, and then 10 weeks in the cold northern hills pressing grief into work, and then 3 months watching him become the person he had always been capable of being. And now I was sitting in the firelight of the home we were building together with his hand around mine, and the wolf warmth between us like a quiet, certain fire. My mother used to say that a woman who survived with grace was stronger than any warrior who survived with a sword. I believe her now. But I have added something to it, something she didn't say and I think she knew. The real strength is not just surviving. The real strength is choosing to go back. To walk into the difficult thing with your eyes open and your hands ready. To love something that has hurt you because you can see what it is underneath the hurt and you believe in what it can become. That is the hardest thing, the most human thing. The most worth doing. 6 months after the Battle of the Northern Ridge, the 7 territories signed a unified peace accord with the reformed Eastern Bloc, the first such accord in 30 years. The Healer Corps expansion I had designed became permanent policy across all 7 territories, the first formal medical system the kingdom had ever maintained. Warden Caro's Kane stood trial and was exiled to the outer islands, which he reached on a ship that his daughter did not come to see off. Vora Kane, I was told, had gone back to the hills where she had grown up, before her father's ambitions had turned her into a tool. I hope she found something there worth keeping. Elder Rowena attended the formal rebonding ceremony between Cale and I on the first day of spring. She sat in the front and looked at us with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for 2 people to stop being idiots for a very long time and is enormously satisfied to see them finally get there. After the ceremony, she found me in the garden. "Your mother would be proud," she said. "She would have told me I was slow," I said. Rowena smiled, "That too." Cale found me later, standing at the edge of the garden where the first spring flowers had come through the snow. He stood beside me, and we looked at the hills together in the new season light. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That the north is still beautiful from here," I said. "We could go," he said, "in the summer to the clinic to your father's house." I looked at him. "You would come north." "Wherever you go," he said simply, "certainly, I go." I pressed my shoulder against his arm. The wolf warmth was there, the bond between us, the thing that had been reaching for itself across a year of pain and 10 weeks of cold and 1 morning of a battlefield where nothing worked except a name. "Seraphine," he said, not because he needed to, just because he could, just because it was the word that meant everything he had learned to mean. "Still here," I said. "Yes," he said, "you are." And the spring light came through the hills, and the kingdom was whole, and we stood in it together.